The sun hung high above the desert, casting a bright orange glow over the harsh landscape. In the distance, the sharp mountains loomed, their peaks hidden behind the burning haze of the midday heat. This was the Wild West, dangerous, beautiful, and unforgiving. Jedediah, Big McKinney, stood tall and strong, his broad shoulders and thick arms making him a giant compared to the average man. His height was intimidating, and his muscles rippled under the rough fabric of his shirt. He was known for his strength, a strength that could move mountains, or at least make the toughest ranch jobs look easy. But despite his size, Jed had always felt alone. He wasn't like other men. His sheer size made him an outcast. People in the towns whispered about him, always careful not to get too close. He was different, and different was not always welcome in the West. The rumors about Jed ran wild, some saying he had fought in the bloodiest battles and had survived things no one else could. But no matter what anyone said, Jed preferred being alone. Jed had left civilization behind long ago, seeking peace on a small, dusty ranch that lay on the edge of Apache territory. The Apache were a people with their own ways, their own rules. While the townspeople feared them, Jed didn't. He respected them. But he never got too close. One scorching afternoon, Jed was working in the fields, his broad back hunched over as he fixed the broken fence that surrounded his property. Sweat dripped down his face, his shirt soaked through with the heat. He could feel the dry wind against his skin as he worked, the world around him still and quiet, except for the occasional rustle of desert plants. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something moving in the distance. At first he thought it was a mirage, those tricks the desert liked to play on the mind. But as it grew closer, he saw it wasn't a mirage at all. A woman. Her movements were hurried, as though she was running from something, or someone. She wore the clothes of an Apache woman, and Jed could see the fear in her eyes as she glanced over her shoulder. The heat of the day made the air shimmer around her. But there was no doubt in Jed's mind this woman was in trouble. Without thinking, Jed set down his tools and moved toward her, his giant steps quick and quiet for a man his size. He could see she was struggling, her face pale with exhaustion, her breath shallow and panicked. As he approached, he heard the sound of horses. The pounding of hooves grew louder, and Jed knew immediately what was happening. Outlaws. They had seen her and were coming to capture her, likely to sell her to the highest bidder, as they did with many captured people from the Apache tribes. Jed's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know this woman, and yet he couldn't let them take her. He had no reason to care for someone he had never met, but something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the memory of his own days fighting in wars, when he had stood up for what was right. Maybe it was the loneliness that had haunted him for so long, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to live his life alone. Whatever the reason, Jed knew he couldn't stand by. He ran toward her, his feet thundering against the ground. She looked up, startled, and instinctively backed away, her eyes wide with fear. Jed raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he called, his deep voice steady and calm. "Those men, they're bad news. You need to run," but the woman didn't move. Instead, she stared at him as if she was trying to decide whether he was a friend or another danger. The sound of the outlaws' horses grew louder. There was no time to waste. Jed took a step forward. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and serious. "They'll take you." "I won't let that happen." The woman hesitated, her body tense, but then, as if deciding she had no other choice, she nodded. With a quick glance behind her, she turned and ran toward Jed, her feet kicking up the dust as she moved. Jed didn't wait. He turned and sprinted with her, his powerful legs covering the ground quickly. The outlaws were closing in now, just a few hundred yards behind them. But Jed was faster. He could hear their angry shouts, but he didn't slow down. He had to get her to safety. He reached a rocky outcrop where they could hide, its jagged edges providing a perfect place to take cover. Jed helped the woman climb onto the rocks, his big hands gently lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She gave him a quick, surprised look, but said nothing as she scrambled to the top. Jed climbed up behind her, his large frame barely fitting through the narrow spaces between the rocks. They crouched together in the shade, trying to stay hidden. The outlaws arrived soon after, their horses skidding to a halt as they searched the area. Jed watched from his hiding place, his heart pounding in his chest. There were 3 of them, all armed and ready for trouble. They shouted as they circled, but they didn't see Jed or the woman. Minutes passed like hours as the outlaws scoured the area, Jed could feel his muscles tense, waiting for any sign that they were about to be discovered. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the outlaws gave up and rode off, disappearing into the distance. Jed let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He stood slowly, stretching his sore muscles. The woman, still wide-eyed, climbed down from the rocks and turned to face him. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she stared at him in silence. Jed wiped the sweat from his brow and spoke first. "You all right?" She nodded, but still didn't speak. There was a wariness in her eyes, as if she was unsure of what to make of this giant of a man who had just saved her life. I don't know what to say," she said after a long pause, her voice soft and hesitant. Jed gave her a small smile. "You don't have to say anything. You're safe now." She studied him for a moment, then spoke again, this time with more confidence. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jed shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I don't leave people to suffer. Not if I can help it." The silence stretched between them, but this time it felt more comfortable. The woman who had been so fearful just moments before seemed to relax slightly. She looked at him more closely now, her gaze softening. "I am Nayeli," she said, finally offering him her name. I'm not used to strangers helping me." Jed nodded, understanding. "I'm Jed. I've spent most of my life as a stranger myself." Nayeli looked around, taking in her surroundings. "I should go. The people who took me, they may come back." Jed hesitated. He could tell she wasn't just worried about the outlaws. There was something else in her eyes. Fear. But it wasn't for herself. It was for the people she cared about. He could see that much. "You can stay with me," Jed offered, "at least until it's safe. You don't have to go back out there alone." For a moment, Nayeli said nothing, as if weighing her options. But then, without a word, she nodded, and so together, they walked back toward Jed's ranch, where the night would bring new challenges, and perhaps a chance for both of them to find something more than they had ever expected. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the desert. The wind shifted, cooling the hot, dry air that had baked the land all day. Jed and Nayeli walked side by side, the dust of the desert swirling around them. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond that had started to grow in the hours since their unexpected meeting. Jed could see the exhaustion in Nayeli's eyes, the weariness from the days of running and hiding. He hadn't asked her much about what had happened, but he could guess. People didn't get captured unless they were hunted, and Nayeli wasn't the kind to be caught easily. He admired her strength, though he could tell she was struggling to trust him completely. The journey back to Jed's ranch was long and quiet. They passed the dry riverbed and the rocky hills that bordered the land, making their way to the small house Jed had built years ago. It was simple, but it was his. He had never expected anyone to share it with him, let alone an Apache woman like Nayeli. When they reached the ranch, Jed led her inside. The place was sparse but practical. There was a wood stove in the corner, a few chairs around a rough-hewn table, and a bed covered with thick blankets. It was nothing fancy, but it was shelter, and right now that was enough. "You can stay here as long as you need," Jed said as he moved toward the stove. "I've got enough supplies to last us a while." Nayeli nodded, though she seemed uncomfortable. She had been trained to survive on her own in the wild. Asking for help, especially from someone she didn't know well, was difficult for her. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. Her eyes lowered. Jed glanced over his shoulder, seeing the hesitation in her posture. "You're not a burden. If I've learned anything in my life, it's that there's no shame in needing help when the world is too harsh to handle alone." She met his gaze for a moment before nodding, accepting his words even though she didn't fully believe them. For now, she was grateful for the safety of the ranch, and that was enough. Later that evening, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the two of them sat outside on the porch. The stars were bright in the clear desert sky, and the sounds of the night, chirping insects and the distant howl of a coyote, filled the silence between them. Jed sat back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "You don't have to talk about it, but if you ever want to, I'm here." Nayeli was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "I was taken," she began, her voice steady but filled with pain, "by a group of men who wanted to sell me. They attacked my village, killed many of my people. They didn't care who we were or what we meant to each other. We were just goods to them." Jed's jaw tightened as she spoke. The cruelty of it disgusted him, but he said nothing. He wasn't sure what comfort his words could offer, so he simply listened. They thought they could break me, Nayeli continued. But I've been taught to survive, to keep my head down and wait for the right moment. And when the time came, I escaped. But I was weak. They were close behind me when I ran into you. Jed's heart ached for her. He had seen enough violence in his life to know the scars it left behind. He didn't say anything, but his thoughts turned inward. He had his own battles, ones that had shaped him into the man he was today. But even now, as a man of strength, he still carried the weight of those memories. I don't know what to do now, Nayeli added softly, looking down at the ground. I don't have a home to go back to. My people are scattered, and I don't know if I'll ever find them. Jed looked at her, his eyes steady. You've got a place here, for as long as you need it. Nayeli didn't say anything, but her eyes softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she seemed to relax. They sat together in silence, the warmth of the night settling around them. It was a moment of peace, something that neither of them had known for a long time. The next few days passed quickly. Jed showed Nayeli the land around the ranch, teaching her how to tend to the animals and care for the crops he had planted. She was a quick learner, and soon she became just as useful around the ranch as Jed was. But as time went on, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something worse than the outlaws who had chased Nayeli. The air felt thick with tension, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. And then, one afternoon, the danger Jed had feared arrived. They were working together in the fields, the sun beating down on them as they planted corn in the dry soil. The wind kicked up dust from the ground, and the sharp scent of sagebrush filled the air. Suddenly, Jed's keen ears picked up the sound of something in the distance, hooves galloping fast. Nayeli looked up, her eyes narrowed. They're back, she said, her voice sharp with recognition. Jed's heart sank. He had hoped they would be left alone, but the world didn't work like that. He turned to her. Get inside, quickly! But Nayeli shook her head. I won't hide again. I'll fight, Jed hesitated, then nodded. He understood her need to stand her ground. He had his own battles to fight, too. They ran toward the small barn where Jed kept his rifle and spare ammunition. The sound of the outlaws' horses grew louder, the heavy pounding of hooves echoing across the land. Jed grabbed his rifle and handed it to Nayeli. You know how to use this? She took the rifle with surprising skill, her fingers steady as she checked the chamber. I do. Jed nodded, and they took their positions behind the barn, hidden from view. The outlaws, led by their cruel leader, Tommy Buck, had found them. Tommy was a tall, lean man with a scar running down his cheek, and he was known for his ruthlessness. The outlaws pulled up in front of the barn, their eyes scanning the area. They were looking for a fight, and Jed was ready to give them one. We know you're in there, McKinney, Tommy called out, his voice filled with malice. Come out and face us like a man. Jed's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, stepping into view, his massive form casting a long shadow. The outlaws froze for a moment, surprised by his sheer size. But Tommy smirked as if he didn't fear a giant like Jed. You don't scare me, Tommy sneered. You're alone. No one to help you. Jed met his gaze, his voice calm but filled with authority. You're wrong about that. And then, just as Tommy moved to shout an order, Nayeli fired. The shot rang out like thunder, striking one of the outlaws in the leg. The others scrambled, drawing their guns and firing wildly. It was a fight for survival, and it was over quickly. The outlaws, outmatched by the skill and precision of Jed and Nayeli, were forced to retreat, leaving behind their horses and weapons. As the dust settled, Jed and Nayeli stood together, their breathing heavy but their spirits high. They had won. Together. Nayeli looked up at Jed, her eyes filled with something that wasn't there before. Trust, respect, and maybe even something more. Jed smiled, a rare, soft smile. Looks like you don't need anyone to protect you after all. Nayeli's lips curved into a faint smile. I needed you, Jed. You gave me something I thought I'd lost. Jed nodded, his heart full. You don't have to be alone anymore. The night fell quiet again, the stars twinkling overhead, and for the first time in years, both Jed and Nayeli felt something they had never expected to find. A sense of belonging, a sense of home. Together they had survived the worst, and now together they could face whatever came next.